good afternoon. I keep saying the same thing depending on when you're watching this video. Today I decided to study a different reading strategy because I have already taught you how to read a text paragraph after paragraph by going into the details and spotlighting the main sentences in a text and try to rephrase them in order to extract a plan. So this is the traditional way of reading in depth an article. Today what I would like to teach you is a different skill that might come in very handy in certain circumstances. I'm thinking about oral examinations for those who are given texts, but also for those who are a bit in a rush in an exam and who want to read quickly an article. This skill is the skill of skim reading. So there are very many different strategies when it comes to skim read. Skim read means that you will read on the surface or superficially the text in order to get the gist, to get the main ideas, and rapidly extract a plan from having read simply the first sentences. So that's why I call it the strategy of the first sentences in each paragraph. I will explain this a bit later. I use this quite regularly when I have to assess students for oral exams, if I haven't read the text before, or if I am in a bit of a rush. I'm going to go through the first sentences of each paragraph. There you go. So I'm going to use simply those first parts, those first sentences, and I won't bother reading the rest of the paragraphs. That's something I can do later and that I will need to do later in order to get more detail and to feed and feel what my plan will come up to be. But at the moment, what I want is very quickly, by scanning this text through, manage to see where it's going. As per usual, and this I will keep repeating until the end, you need to make sure you read the title carefully. It gives away what the text is about. And the reason why I was attracted to this piece of journalism is because it says, "Can mistreated dogs ever be considered art?" At the moment, in those times of coronavirus, you're told a lot about how to cultivate your artistic skills and visit museums online for free and to expand your cultural knowledge. And this question of art is really at the heart of many conversations. People are like, oh, well, you might spend your time watching paintings or works of art. And so this question of art is relevant, I think. It's resonating. But also, the reason I chose that one is obviously I'm an animal lover, is because a few years ago, I think a long time ago, 10, 15 years ago, I read an article about an Argentinian or Uruguayan artist who had let a dog starve in a museum to see how people would react and if ever they would consider this as art. Right. So this is something you can look into. I think it was in 2007 or 8. And obviously it raised a lot of concerns, and it sparked protests all over the world because people in the museum hadn't reacted. They thought it was art simply because there was like a fence around the dog and it said dog dying, so people thought it was a work of art. At the end of the day, the dog was suffering and nobody did anything. So this is a much more recent example. In 2017, something happened in the Guggenheim Museum in New York, and I do not want to get into the details of this article since the point of this lesson today is to show you how to use those first sentences as I've mentioned earlier. Right, so what I will start doing is I will select and pick all these sentences and place them on another document, right? So I will be left with this document. Okay, so I kept the first one because it was a very long sentence. That's only one sentence, all of this. But remember that the header, which is like the very beginning, the start of an article, most of the time will give you a lot of information. And I thought this one I couldn't do without, right? So I have to keep the title, I have to keep the header. But then all I did is I kept not only sentences, but segments, because I thought they were enough for us to understand what was going on. Let me give you an example with the start of this article. So the header is here. The decision by the Guggenheim Museum in New York to pull 3 pieces from an upcoming exhibit after 600,000 people signed a petition claiming the depicted animal cruelty has revealed unusual tripwires across the well-trodden arguments around freedom of speech and cultural offensiveness. Right, so I do get the initial situation already. I know that this takes place in New York City, in the museum, the Guggenheim Museum, that it concerns 3 pieces of art that were supposed to be displayed in an exhibit. Be careful. Exhibition is different from an exposition. Right? We don't say this in English, we say exhibition or exhibit. And then there was a petition signed by quite many people here because it depicted animal cruelty. So I get the initial situation, I understand now, and I already knew what that would be about when I read the title. But then this is a bit more complicated to understand. Unusual tripwires, which means like almost like when how shall I explain this? When power is tripwiring, it means like is disjuncting, so it's not working anymore. The well-trodden means that they are very famous arguments, okay? Well-trodden are arguments that we keep talking about over and over and over again. A well-trodden path is usually when we use this. To tread is to step or walk on something. So well-trodden means many people have walked that path where they have had an argument around, and we have the 2 main concepts here, freedom of speech and cultural offensiveness. So if you have a bit of abstraction, well, you don't need that much abstraction to understand. We're talking about art. Okay, that's the main object of our lesson, art. And apparently that creates a conflation between freedom of speech and cultural offensiveness. So you already know which kind of debate will probably be raised. It's around, can you do anything in art, or will you offend people by doing anything you feel like? Okay, I'm thinking about, you may have heard about this, and I'm gonna look at this online, but you may have heard about Duchamp, maybe. I don't know if I'm going to find this. Yes, you've probably heard about this work of art when it was released. It was not so much a criticism, but when Duchamp released this urinal, what he wanted to say is that anything can be turned into art. Right, but some people were obviously very offended at the time and said, "Well, first it's disgusting, and it shouldn't be in a museum. That's not where it should be located." And so, art has always questioned what is offending people or not, what is art or not. So that's worth wondering. All these questions are very interesting. That's why I picked this article. So. I'm going to minimize this, go back to the text, which I've lost. Where is my second text? There you go. It's not here, it must be here. Okay, there we are. Here we are. So we already know what this will be about. And I don't need to explain this. You will see yourself is one. Oh, sorry, I forgot to change this. I think in the original text, I may have, wait a minute, I'm going to find the text. Yeah, I may have picked the wrong one. It said 1, a second word, so I'm going to include this to my document. There you go, I'm going to find it somewhere. Maybe, where is the second one? It's here. Right, so I'm picking up this second one, and as I said, I don't need to explain, but you understand there were 3 pieces that were removed from the museum, and it says one of the pieces, a second work, and a third work. So, well, it's very easy to identify what those 3 paragraphs will be about. They are explaining what each of those pieces were. They will probably describe and depict what each of those pieces were, and then we might understand the reason why they were pulled out of the museum or from the museum. Okay, so I don't want the details so far. Just know that I will be given the 3, or at least a description of the 3 pieces that are at stake here. Now, if I continue in this text, it says, the museum said in a news release this week that its decision to pull the 3 pieces rested on explicit and repeated threats of violence it had received. This is interesting because first it pinpoints the fact that people react very strongly to this feeling when you read threats of violence. Maybe there were death threats sent to the people in charge of the museum, and also that's interesting because the museum said that the reason why they had pulled the pieces is the threats of violence. So far, they don't mention the fact that the pieces were a bit provocative or offensive. It's just because they received threats of violence. Right. Continuing, so I already see the text. I don't need to read all the rest. I can see the progression of the ideas. Moving on to the next paragraph, from which I extracted only the first sentence, but that posed the question whether, in similar circumstances involving human participants, the institution would have taken steps to protect the art. And this time we are getting closer, we are edging closer, or inching closer to this debate about freedom of speech and cultural offensiveness, because someone says, had the human participants been, can you see this structure? I'm going to write it because it's interesting. So, had the participants been human, which comes down to saying if the participants had been. But remember what we said, like you can displace this and relocate it at the beginning of the sentence by dropping the if at the beginning. So, had the participants been human, would the institution have taken the same steps to protect the art? Would the museum have made that decision of pulling the pieces of art from the museum? Right. So this is this question already of, is there a difference between animals and humans? Can we do anything with humans? Can we objectify them even in the name of art? So this is interesting because it already elevates the debate. It's not simply this row over this is offensive or this is not offensive. This is a debate about what is art and are animals different from humans. So when I say elevate, it expands this debate. Next paragraph is the museum's decision to withdraw the works is an unusual conflation of human and animal rights. So once again, we are in the same vein as the previous paragraph. It's all about this debate regarding animals. Are they different from humans? Do they have different rights? Should they be treated differently? Right. Next paragraph. I'm going fast. Yeah, that's all I'm left with is this, right? So I can very quickly read through this article. The next paragraph is a long sentence that I've kept. The Guggenheim Comstock points out. So I have removed part of the text. I don't know who Comstock is, but I suppose this is a commentator on the situation. He will probably be identified on the second reading when I get more into the details. So the Guggenheim says it withdrew the exhibits not because it was persuaded by the merits of ethical arguments on behalf of the animals, but because they claimed to have been threatened with violence and could not protect visitors to the museum. So this is reminiscent of what we read here. So the reason for pulling those works of art out was not so much the ethical debate, but it was more protecting visitors from the museum, because surely if this exhibition had been kept and had been maintained, then many demonstrators would have used violence in order to prevent it. Maybe demonstrators would have rammed in the museum to prevent this exhibition, and that would have threatened or jeopardized the safety of the visitors. So that's the only reason why the Guggenheim removed those pieces. And once again, it's not because it was persuaded by the merits of ethical arguments on behalf of the animals. So it makes it very clear that the museum was not concerned about animal rights at all, was well beyond that debate. It was just a question of safety and how many controversies had been sparked by this exhibition. Next paragraph. After the Guggenheim took the decision to withdraw the work, Ingrid Neuwerk, president of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, thanked the institution. So this is a very simple sentence. You understand that this is the position of the museum. They had to remove it due to threats. But for animal lovers and animal rights advocates, it was necessary to remove them, and they thanked the museum for stopping this exhibition. But, and I will not stress this enough, but when you see a but in an article, it's usually the interesting moment when something happens, because they will stress, or the journalist will stress, a paradox or a tension, a contention, something that is moving the debate on, or the article on. But the museum, so we're going to read this next bit, but the museum now faces accusations that it caved to pressure from animal rights activists in place of any reasoned argument about the work itself. So once again, you get this repetition of ideas. It's sinking in now. You understand that the museum caved to pressure. To cave to pressure means to give in, like you stop fighting the pressure. You just cave to pressure. It means like you accept it. You say, okay, fine, I've got pressure. I'm removing those exhibits from the exhibition. But the decision of removing those exhibits is actually the reason why the museum is blamed, is because the only reason why they removed it is not so much because they thought that in terms of ethics or in terms of art, it was not justified. It's simply because they caved to pressure. And maybe some people, you can already extrapolate and think, maybe some people thought, well, it shouldn't happen. You should have the right to express whatever you feel or exhibit and display whatever you want without having to be threatened by activists. So the museum was blamed for accepting to be bullied into removing those pieces of art. Because yes, indeed, that's part of that freedom of speech debate. Can you say anything you please, or do you have to bow under the pressure of people who would want you to stop saying some things? So once again, we're back to the debate on to what extent can you express your views, or to what extent can you say whatever you please? To what extent can you show whatever you please? Now, I just used this one in the next paragraph. The issue is not short on precedent, so we know that this has happened before. It's not the first time that such a thing has happened, that an exhibition has been the object of controversies and criticized for offending people. So we will probably be explained or given another example. So I don't want to get into the details of this. I just know that there are other examples. Next paragraph. Oops, I don't know why this is coming up. There you go. So I'm back to my document here. Next paragraph. In that instance, so when they say in that instance, which means that example, it probably refers to the previous example that will be detailed when you read the text a second time or go back for the details. So Art News reports, the argument was advanced that while the Art Institute was committed to freedom of speech, it was swayed by the public safety argument. So once again, we're back to this in this previous examples that these previous examples that will be mentioned, already this issue of freedom of speech and public safety arguments, public safety, are back to the fore, which means that how safe is it to express your views? How safe is it to use your freedom of speech or freedom to, design a piece of art that is offensive? But to Comstock, we're back to this man. We're going to have to identify him at some point. But to Comstock at the Culture and Animals Foundation, this is a case in which the Guggenheim should have kept the video on display. So this man, we know for a start that he thinks the museum should have taken a different decision. Right? And then the last paragraph starts with a very interesting sentence. And I think if you were to open up and expand on a commentary, branch out with your commentary, this would be the sentence I would comment upon. It's bad art. They use the word bad, but it's fine. It's bad art, but in my opinion, but that's an aesthetic, not moral judgment. So we can try to discuss this, maybe not philosophically, because that would be a never-ending debate. But what is art, basically? Is it simply aesthetic? Is it moral? Is it ethical? Should there be moral in art? Well, this is a Pandora's box. Once you open it, there are so many things to discuss. Right. So see already, we've read simply the first sentences for each paragraph, and we know what this will be about. We know, at least we get the main ideas. Problem is, we need to organize these, because once you went through those sentences, you might say, yeah, I've got a rough idea of what the text is about, but if I wanted to present it to an examiner, I would need to put some order in all of this. And that's why it's time for you to use tables in which you will identify what each of those paragraphs are about. So what I did is I simply replaced all these sentences we've read together, and I gave them a title. I think when I say a title, I just basically slapped a tag on each paragraph just to know what each of those paragraphs refer to. So remember this first header that we read together? Well, this is obviously the initial problem. As any article, it usually starts with a problem, a situation, because otherwise there would be nothing to talk about. Right. The next 3 paragraphs are example 1, 2, and 3 of the 3 exhibits that were removed. The one saying that it was simply the threats of violence that were at the origin of this decision is basically what decision was made. Okay, so I just try to identify very quickly what this stands for. The next paragraph is about the question of human participants. Remember what we said? Would it be different if it were humans that were exhibited and displayed? So this is part of the wider debate around animal rights. Right. The next one is the main argument of that debate is that there's a conflation between or conflation of human and animal rights. So these 2 paragraphs will probably will have to be combined at some point. Because they participate in this idea that we cannot just confuse animals and humans in terms of rights. Moving on, we're back to the decision from the museum, which was not made on behalf of the animals, but simply because they were threatened with violence. So this is the museum's opinion. No animal rights, but threats. Okay, so we know where the museum stands. The museum is not taking position. The museum is not saying, oh, well, we have to defend animal rights. No. The museum's position is we had to remove those exhibits because we were threatened. If we had not been threatened, whoops, I miss an A here, threatened. Here, once again, I invite you to have a look at this. You say, had we not been threatened. Okay, once again, you can go through this funny grammatical sentence. Right, that's part of the advanced structure. We would not have removed those exhibits. Okay, so the museum is very clear. They were totally unconcerned by those animal rights. They simply remove them due to threats. Now, we obviously are given as readers the position of the people at the other side of the spectrum, at the other end of the spectrum. So animal rights advocates said that we need to defend animals. That's why they thanked the institution. So opposition of views here. Next paragraph are the polemics regarding the decision, because the museum faces accusations for removing those exhibits. So we can see that it's not the exhibit themselves that create the polemic, even though people signed a petition. So there's a first polemic as regards the nature of the exhibition, but there's a second polemic regarding the decision that was made by the museum. Now, remember what we said, there was a previous example, right, that we will get into a bit later on. This precedent, which feeds the same, this previous example, feeds the debate of freedom of speech and public safety. Okay. And the last two paragraphs are opinions by or from Comstock, when he says that first, the museum should have kept the video on display, and that it's bad art, but it's art anyway, so we shouldn't have any ethical view on this exhibition. So once I've got all these very easy tags on each of the paragraphs, my next step will be to organize the ideas. So what I did here is I kept the same order as the text, which is often the case. We're not gonna fool ourselves. The journalist, or when he or she writes his or her article, is following a reasoning of his own or her own. So the journalist probably goes in a certain order and a progression so that we might understand what is going on. So what I did is I already thought that, well, all these first parts belong together because it's what the initial problem was and what decision was made. So I combined all of them together. Second part in blue is this debate around animal rights. Okay, so for the museum, it was not about animal rights. For animal advocates, it was about animal rights. All right. And the last part is the previous examples, the polemics it creates, and once again, how this is part of a wider debate. But I was not so satisfied with this. I thought, I can see a mix of things here. So if I really go into the details, okay, if I want to give titles, because this is not enough. Once I have combined all of this together, I need to give them titles. So that's why I prepared a column here in which I will give like the main title this part, main title this part, main title this part. But what I was very dissatisfied with is I thought that there were things in between that didn't fit in, which I colored in, I highlighted them in yellow. I thought that actually, if we had a closer look at each part, especially the second and the third part, there were things that needed to be reorganized. Because, as I said, if I consider that this first part is the situation, right? I can keep all of these paragraphs together. Moving on to the second, if I consider that the second part in blue is about the issue of animal rights, this seems to be a bit out of place because this is about the opinions regarding the decision that was made here. And this is not so much about animal rights here, it's just different opinions on the decision that was made. So I thought, I'm not sure these two paragraphs really fit into this part. So I colored them differently. And then in the last bit in green, which I called reactions to the decisions, I thought actually those two reactions could fit into my green part. So I'm gonna keep that in mind and do the same thing, because in this green part I noticed that the very last part is about the opinion on what is art. It's not so much about the reactions to the decision here. It's more about what is art, what is aesthetic, what is moral, what is not moral, the judgment, whatever. So what I have to do next, and this is going to be my last step, but I need to find it. So if My computer wants to help me there. My last step is to completely reorganize my parts. And as you can see, I have moved some bits around. So let me show you. I've kept my 3 parts, which is the initial situation, what is at stake, the issue of animal rights, and the reactions to the decision. But remember those yellow parts that was here? I moved them in the green part. So now I do have something that is much more consistent in my view. So I do get the initial situation with the initial problem, and then what are the 3 examples and the decision that was made. So this makes sense. I'm happy with my first part. Second part, much smaller, I get the issue of animal rights. So the wider debate around animal rights, the main arguments of the debate, and the extra opinion by Comstock at the end, right? So all of this belongs to this debate on animal rights. And then the last part are the reactions to the decision. And obviously, I will put together the polemics that the decision sparked. The previous example that created as well like extra arguments for that debate between freedom of speech and public safety. And then the opinion at the end, okay, of the man. But I also added the opinion of the museum and the opinion of the animal rights advocates. So all the opinions of people regarding this decision I chucked in this same part called reactions to the decision. Last point I want to make is when I look at this plan, so I've got situation, issue of animal rights, reactions to the decision, I think I am entitled to reorganize those 3 parts because in my view, it would make more sense to start obviously with the initial situation, explaining what decision was made. But what I would do is I would make this my first part, but I would make this my second part, the part in green, because I think it makes sense to describe the situation, but then sorry, because my computer is ventilating, it makes quite a lot of noise. So this is my first situation, but the reactions to the decisions might be more coherent and consistent if they came second. And then the last part is the issue of animal rights, because if you finish with this part, it will make it easier for you to transition towards your commentary, which is very likely to be about the role of art and the debate around art, maybe animal rights, or so basically this will open up many different issues. What is art? How far can you go? To what extent can you use animals in art? What is the purpose of art? Okay, so if you want to create this transition, it's much better to finish with the stronger element, because to be quite honest, this is, well, when you describe a situation, this is very commonplace. A decision was made because there was a polemic. People reacted, they were either in favor or not, they thought that it was right, that it was wrong. But now if we elevate the debate, this is why this article becomes interesting. Is because it raises the issue of animal rights and it raises the issue of what art is. And that's how you construct a plan. And as you can see, we've only used the first sentences for each paragraph. Now, if you're interested to go into the details, you can have a look into those pieces to understand what this whole debate was about, this whole polemic. So if you go onto the Guardian website, you can find this article, and they show you what this first piece of art was. So basically, 2 dogs were facing one another on a treadmill. They are, I think they're pit bulls, they're very aggressive dogs, and they wanted to fight one another. So if you have a look at the video, basically, those dogs were hurting by trying to attack one another, they could hurt themselves, and that's why people were offended by this piece of art. So I invite you to have a look. And the last point I'm going to make is that your work after watching this video, and I think that's going to be fun, to be honest, is to select a piece of art that you find online or that you already know. It can be any kind of art. It can be architecture, it can be painting, can be sculptures, it can be anything, photographies. I want you to select one piece of art and I want you to present it showing why, in your view, this is a case in point, that this is the perfect representation of what art is. So basically, I'm just asking you to present a piece of art, a work of art that particularly resonates with you. Why do you consider this is art? Or maybe try to choose something that is more questioning, okay? Try to to choose, I don't know, works that are arguable, like Duchamp with his urinal, like, is this art or not? How far can we go? And then I'm gonna let you know more about the details of how to present this work of art. I would like you to record yourself presenting this work of art, and after the holidays we could have a view at the various works of art you have selected.